doing here is this, to stress this to you incredibly clearly. In the short run, there's only one way the supply curve can change, up or down, because that is, and it's caused by a change in marginal cost. Nothing else, because in the short run you can't change capital. In the long run, the supply industry can essentially move left or right, even though you might say it looks like it's going up or down. Left or right. As firms enter the industry, there's more firms, or there's more capital and less capital. Everybody? So what's going to happen here, as we're going to subsequently see, is we could have started here with the industry. There's an economic profit. Firms will enter the industry until we have this equilibrium right here at minimum average cost. Right here, okay? So notice the sequence. When you draw this, and you're drawing it, you can draw it from an equilibrium here and then draw this. In some ways that might be better theoretically, but I wouldn't do it that way. I draw this like this, but this defines the demand function simply because ultimately the demand supply function defines the supply function, I should say, because it will ultimately move to give this. But it's not this by itself that does it. Okay, so good. We got that. We'll come back to that later. This is P0. And this is Q0. And so then, that'll be one mark over here to the left. Understanding that when I say we're at an equilibrium where price is at zero economic profit, it'll be here and here. And then over here, the demand function must intersect the supply function to give that. Now, strictly speaking, it shouldn't be like this, because you can see this is below this, but this is minimum average variable cost, and all firms have the same minimum average variable cost, so this shouldn't happen. Strictly speaking, this and this should line up. I don't care, but I do care that this intersects at minimum average cost, right? To give the output of the industry. Okay, so we're going to do that more, and then at this point, it's because we have 1,000 restaurants. Because 200 restaurants came in, caused supply to shift like that, and then I'm going to say this equilibrium here is 100. A typical restaurant produces 100 meals in a night at zero economic profit, and the industry produces 10,000. Wait a minute. Produces, how many restaurants do I want to hear? 1,000, 100,000. Okay, good. All right? Good. Now, I'm going to find out, and you're going to find out whether you learned anything. Dispel your mind any foolishness like this. I'm going to ask you a question. Your hand goes up and asks, I need to do something. Yes, you need to do something. But you need to figure out what to do. Okay? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to have an increase in fixed costs. An increase in fixed costs. In particular, I'm going to give you an example. We're going to have, rather than a tax per unit, say a tax per meal, which is a variable cost which we talked about last day to deal with again. We're going to say that the government of the Toronto, rather than taxing each restaurant, say $1, to raise money for whatever, highways or something, we're going to tax each restaurant an extra $1,000 of property tax, or it's going to be an extra $1,000 for a licensing fee. Now notice this is a fixed change. It's a change in the fixed cost. It doesn't matter whether the restaurant produces anything or nothing. They're going to pay an extra $1,000 to have that licensing fee or that property tax. All right? So this is a fixed cost. Now then, here's what I want you to do. On the left, and I want you to do this with your full knowledge and not talking to your pals and really thinking about it, because this is where you really understand what you're doing. Work theoretically. Change the cost functions as you should. With an increase in fixed cost, what happens to the marginal cost function? What happens to the average cost function? This is your first hurdle. You got 1 minute. Oh, and please do this, because at the end, we're gonna do all this stuff over again with people at the board. And it's not that I want to embarrass you, in fact, I don't want to embarrass you at all. But I do want to point out to you mistakes that you have made. So you will be coming to the board very likely, and we will find the mistakes you made. So please, prepare yourself enough that you can put a decent effort into it. Okay? All right. Should we change the marginal cost function? How many say we should? How many change the marginal cost function? Don't be shy. How many changed it? You're the only one? You're an honest person. You two people are honest. The rest of you have no belief in you at all, as it turns out. No, you should not change the marginal cost function. That's the first thing that's weird. Fixed costs go up, marginal costs don't change because of this. The $1,000 is paid today for the right to have the restaurant. It has no effect whatsoever in additional meal. An additional meal cost $10 yesterday, and it costs $10 today. The change in fixed costs has no effect whatsoever on marginal cost, i.e. the cost of an additional meal. Fundamental, everybody, fundamental. If you know calculus, you think of the derivative of a constant, it is zero. But, for those of you who want to jump to that, but basically that's an important thing. Now, most students, they can hardly resist losing that day, right? Okay, then, for one reason or another, they can hardly resist it. So, that doesn't change. But of course, average cost, variable costs don't change, but fixed costs change. So average cost changes. So I'm going to change average cost. I'm going to shift it up as I did before. All right? Is there anything untoward about which I just did? Yes, Eric? Yeah. You can't just do that. You have, it's a non-parallel shift. Because it's an increase in fixed cost on small units, the average cost jumps up a lot, say like that. And then gets smaller and smaller on average. So the shift up of average cost is smaller and smaller with more units. But no matter what, the minimum must cut marginal cost. So that's the first hurdle. Now I promise you, and if you dare me, for example, just to see, if I ask this question on this exam, at least a third of the class will get that wrong. Another third of the class will get the next step wrong. And basically that'll mean that, you know, almost 70% of the class will end up with virtually no marks whatsoever on this question, which is why I'm not going to ask this on but you need to know. Okay, so now that's the change in average cost. Your next step. What is the change in supply and demand? Well, it turns out demand, of course, doesn't change because this has got nothing to do with demand. So your question is, where do I move supply? Where do I move supply? And if you don't mind, I'll just come around and have a little view of what wonders you people have done. What have we got here? Is this you? Yeah, that's cool. I mean, I don't know what's wrong. Aha! Now you're getting serious. Let's get to it. Oh, yes. Let's see what you got. What are you doing? Let's see. Yeah, move quickly. Gotta move? Well, think about it. What'd you move? Well, you want to give a demand function. Get it in there. Aha. Oh. Oh. What do you got? What you doing? Did you here to learn or here to play? What do you got? You're going to bring down the average. You. People, please stay in the end. I'm going to ask you to do this question, okay? Don't run. You're not trying to test the evidence that you know how to do it. So you show me at the end of the class. How are you doing? All right, I got about 2 people correct. Now everybody, pull it together. Money's on the line here. Does the supply function change in the short run? Are we in the long run? No. So the number of firms in capital can't change. It can't shift left and right. What is the supply function in the short run? What is it? Marginal cost. Did we change marginal cost? No, we did not. So therefore, it does not change. Now, this is almost, part of this stuff is when you do this stuff in exam and under pressure, there's an irresistible movement to change it. But you can't. It doesn't change. So that means since it doesn't change, the short run price doesn't change. The short run quantity doesn't change. Right? There's no change. The price of meals in Toronto will not change. This is a real horror show. In the short run, if the city taxes a fixed tax on the public, on the restaurants, they literally can't pass 1 cent on to the public. Now they would like to. This is the thing. Of course they would. You would say, well, why don't they all raise the price by $1? Because of competition. Competition will drive the price to the marginal cost. Somebody, no matter if they all try to hold up the price, and they would have to collude to do this, but if they try to do that, one of the restaurants realizes, wait a minute, I don't have to, I can charge a lower price because my marginal cost is less, right? Competition will drive the price to marginal cost. So therefore, this is the whole mechanism. They don't want this to happen, but this is what's going to happen. The price will be here. All that happens then is they take the full weight, this amount right here is the economic loss because this is the average cost of that output. They swallow completely the economic loss. Okay? Now it turns out, because I teach this stuff, things come my way. One of my students a couple of years ago said, hey, this is really neat, and I kind of explained something. So I'm going to tell you this in reality. Is this true? Is this really happening in reality? Is it true that marginal cost, that price is driven by marginal cost? So she gave me this explanation. Her father owns a restaurant on the dance floor, kind of Greek park there. And it turned out that the city of Toronto, to increase the attractiveness of the dance floor, put those, like you kind of have on Bloor Street, put in a whole bunch of big concrete pots, so to speak, and put trees in everything. They beautified the sidewalk. And guess what? They did that and they charged the merchants for that cost. So basically they said to the merchants, we're going to do this, and we're going to increase your tax bill by $1,000. And the merchants freaked out. This happened, but the merchants freaked out. They freaked out subsequently because it turns out they cannot pass those costs on to their public. They were charging $10 for a $10 meal, and then their taxes went up by $1,000. They could not increase the price of their meals, so it just was a cost to them in the short run. In the long run, no, as we're going to see. But in the short run, they protested it. Okay? So there's an example of how it actually worked in reality. Now, secondly, notice, we saw before, if you had a per unit tax in a restaurant, depending on the elasticities, the price would go up by some amount, and the sellers would have an economic loss of a certain amount. But it wouldn't be the full amount of the tax. If the government was collecting $1 million from merchants and did it as a $1 tax on meals, the merchants could pass some, but not all of that extra tax onto their consumers. So their cost might end up being like $400,000, $300,000, $500,000, whatever. But if it's a fixed tax of $1 million, they would have to pay it all. Right? Now, as I said, this is my strategy. If I'm running for mayor, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say, okay, hey, that's what we're going to do. How many votes do you think restaurants have? They don't have any. Who cares about those suckers squawking? I'm going to say, we're going to raise money to pay off Toronto debts by charging the restaurants each an extra $5,000. They're going to freak out. They're going to be camped outside my mayor's office. So what? The thing is that's going to happen is the price of meals is not going to go up. The public will be paying the same price of meals, and they'll be paying no tax, and they'll be delighted. And I'll get elected, which is all I already care about. And then in the long run, there'll be a change, which we'll see. But in the short run, the public won't feel the tax at all. But if I tax the public $1 per meal, even though the price won't go up by the amount of the tax, they'll still be paying more for the tax, the meal, and they'll be bitching, and I probably won't pay that. Everybody? Strategy. All right. This is a core idea in economics, a core idea of policy, a core idea of business, blah, blah, blah. You need to think about it. And when you're moving around in your life, you think about this. Marginal cost pricing. Okay. That basically concludes our discussion of the short run. So I went through all that stuff there. Go through my notes, make sure you can understand. There's lots of stuff there, but as I say to you, it's all detailed. Taking you through, explaining what I explained to you, dot. What I just did in the last hour covers everything you never want to know in this test in the short run. Really, if you understand it. Okay, so then, enough of that. Any questions on that? Just by the way, any questions? Good. Now we're going to go to the long run. Now do you notice, by the way, according to this economic theory, we are now making predictions about how certain taxes and changes in costs and demand, how they would affect firms. Output of the industry, price. So we're getting some very specific results. Not only we're getting predict results that can be tested in practice and are useful for us. We're not just talking about supply goes up and demand goes down and there's more sold and blah, blah. We're doing, getting very specific. Okay, I'm going to give you a break in about 4 minutes. Just read this. Recall that all factors, particular capital, are a variable in the long run. There are two ways, plus combinations of the two ways, that capital can change in the long run. You could change the size of the individual firms. Firms could get bigger. They could get bigger. Now this would seem to be an obvious result. That as firms may, as if they wanted to change their capital, they could get bigger or they could get smaller to respond to economic profits or economic losses. And this in fact can happen, but it's actually rare, as it turns out. And it's more complicated in a sense. The more common thing is that all firms, in fact, there's an optimal size of firm, and rather than firms enlarging the size of their firm, so to speak, or their plant, or their location, whatever it is, you'll just have more often. Hey guys, have you ever seen a McDonald's or a Starbucks? Maybe some Starbucks, but only for reasons, some certain reasons for that. McDonald's and Tim Hortons, have you ever seen them be bigger or smaller? They never do that. They produce a certain size, there it is. And if in fact there's more demand, a new one appears within a couple of blocks. But you never change the size of the firm. If I said to you, do you realize that almost all firms producing the same commodity or providing the same service are the same size? And you would say, well, no, of course not. Look at the history, the change in firms. Firms were small 150 years ago, and now, producing plants. They used to have cars. They used to produce carriages for horses and cars subsequently. One guy kind of producing the chassis and all this kind of stuff. And nowadays you have thousands of workers with a huge plant. Yes, but it turns out at any given moment, almost all the firms are the same size. Think of the car manufacturers of the world. Think of just the plants in Ontario. I shouldn't even be talking firms, but I'll talk plants because it's something that's easy to see. The GM plant in Oshawa, the Ford plant in Oakville, and the Honda plant in Alliston, and so on and so forth. Those plants are all the same size. How come? Every single convenience store is virtually the same size. Every single restaurant is the same size. Are there 500-seat restaurants in this town? There are. I hope you never do. It's like Chuck E. Cheese or something like that. Kids go to that. But adults do not go to restaurants with more than a couple of hundred seats. Now, why is that? What about hardware? There used to be hardware stores around the town, and they were all certain sizes, home hardwares and whatever. This is home hardware. But then there's Home Depot, which is exactly the same size, if you go to one of them, as Rona, which is exactly the same size as Lansing, which is exactly the same size as Lowe's. They're all exactly the same size. How come? Every log is the same size, just about. Every log in Sobeys and Dominion are all the same size. How come? How come? Now it turns out we're getting a new size, the Walmart Superstore. And what does that going to mean? The point is, we're going to look at the long run, and we're going to see, in fact, firms could change their size. But in reality, they don't, for reasons we're going to say. And also, it's easier for us to deal with if we don't. Because then we just say they're all the same size, and if we have more firms or less firms of the same size, it's easier to work with. Everybody? So we're going to deal with that, discussing economies of scale. I'm going to do that in the next hour. All right? Take a break. If you've got questions for me for your exam, you got 10 minutes now and 10 minutes.